It's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives for families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I talked about when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, do you get first choice or the consolation prize? You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to talk to you about who's the better advocate for your critically ill loved one, you or the intensive care team. Before I get into today's topic, I want to share a quote with you that I wrote on today's topic, and the quote says, "Society tends to brainwash people into believing they need to be compliant, submissive, and basically a weak pushover when it comes to dealing with doctors and the intensive care team in ICU. Society has brainwashed people that they need to be nice and submissive when dealing with perceived authority and perceived power in intensive care. The reality and the fact of the matter is that if you continue putting doctors and the intensive care team on pedestals, you'll never be a strong advocate for your loved one who's critically ill in intensive care. Just look at what typically happens to 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. Those families have no voice, they are not an advocate for their critically ill loved one, and they basically are at the mercy of the intensive care team. If anything, the 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence have already given away their power by showing weak and submissive body language, and they start falling all over themselves to kiss the intensive care team's ass without knowing what they need to do in order to turn things around. Most families of critically ill patients in intensive care can't handle to start asking the right questions, advocating for their critically ill loved one without coming totally unglued and falling all over themselves because they tend to be so insecure. You need to view the intensive care team as something you need to qualify and find out quickly whether they really have your critically ill loved one's best interest at heart. The intensive care team's perceived authority and their perceived power should not automatically qualify them for you to trust them blindly. So, let's get into today's topics. Most families of critically ill patients in intensive care leave the most important things up to the intensive care team. And most families of critically ill patients in intensive care don't even know what the most important thing is that they have to do when their loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Certainly, asking the right questions, challenging the intensive care team, and asking for the best possible treatment for their critically ill loved one is only scratching the surface when it comes to your loved one being critically ill in intensive care. But more importantly, if your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or if your loved one is in a life-threatening situation, or if your loved one is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, including long-term ventilation. Or your loved one may be having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury. Your critically ill loved one may be threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order. Or your loved one may be in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote unquote in the best interest for your critically ill loved one. Or your loved one may even be approaching their end of life in intensive care. If you and your family and your critically ill loved one are facing one of those challenging, frustrating, and often heartbreaking situations, you need to become a strong advocate for your critically ill loved one, and you can only do that if you have a very good understanding of what's really happening in intensive care. If you don't have a good understanding of what's happening in intensive care, you'll wind up like the 99% of the families of critically ill patients in intensive care, who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. How do I know? Well, after more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, and after I have literally worked with thousands of critically ill patients and their families, I have pretty much seen it all. I know the secret intensive care language, and I can help you translate the intensive care team's talk into your language so that you can understand what's really happening in intensive care. I have also worked for more than 5 years as a nurse unit manager in intensive care, and that gave me plenty of insight into what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. The fact of the matter is that if you don't understand what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care, you can never be a strong advocate for your critically ill loved one. Why is this important? It's important because the intensive care team consciously or unconsciously always implies that they know what's best, or even worse, what's in the best interest for your critically ill loved one. They always claim that they are the only ones who know what's best. Really? If you had seen what I have seen in more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, after literally working with thousands of critically ill patients and their families on an almost intimate level, you would question everything the intensive care team is telling you. You would understand that everything the intensive care team is telling you, or not telling you, is a result of what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. The intensive care team always claims that they are an advocate for your critically ill loved one. Really? Let's just say that your mother, father, husband, wife, child, brother, sister, uncle, aunt, niece, or nephew is in intensive care with a critical illness, and is in one of their most challenging situations during their entire lifetime. Would you really think that there will be a better advocate than you and your family? Do you really think that advocacy is something that should be done by strangers? Do you really think that in a multi-million-dollar per year industry such as intensive care, that care, treatment, diagnosis and prognosis are fair, transparent and not driven by what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care? Do you really think that intensive care is always what you see is what you get. Think twice. You and your family should never leave any advocacy up to a third party. Never, ever. No matter how high the intensive care team sits on their pedestal. So, how can you become the best advocate for your critically ill loved one, and how can you get peace of mind, control, power and influence quickly whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free instant impact report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions. Discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 mind-blowing tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You'll get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where I answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions, or you can call us. Find phone numbers on our contacts tab. Also check out our product section where you get more ebooks, videos and audio recordings, and where you can also get one-on-one consulting with me via Skype, over the phone or via email by clicking on the products tab. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.